Vietnam, a small country in Southeast Asia, bordered by the South China Sea on the east and Thailand and Cambodia on the west. The site of a continuous conflict since 1955 between the South and the North to stop a communist movement and influence from taking over the entire country. In 1961, the United States provided assistance by sending military advisors in to help the South prevent a complete takeover of the country. In response to a confrontation between North Vietnamese and United States naval forces in 1964, known as the Gulf of Tonkin incident, the United States greatly increased its troop presence in 1965, with the objective being to help the South Vietnamese from losing the war with the North. By 1968, with the United States troop strength well over 500,000, this prompted the unexpected call-up of the Kentucky Army National Guard's 2nd Battalion, 138th Field Artillery.
We had gone for home for lunch and turned the news on, and that's when I found out that we had been activated.
Then I started paying attention to the news programs at night. I became a little concerned that we might possibly be called to active duty.
I was at work the day that occurred. We were all a little shocked, I guess, to say the least.
And so we should have known there was something in the wind, but we had, it was a complete surprise to me.
And one of the first parts of the news, it would be called breaking news if we were listening to it today, they made the announcement that the 2nd 138th was being mobilized.
The war had reached deep into America. In April 1968, as part of the buildup, the 2nd Battalion, 138th Field Artillery of the Kentucky Army National Guard was alerted and mobilized. The battalion was further attached to the 1st Armored Division at Fort Hood, Texas, for training and conversion to the new M109 155 self-propelled howitzer.
We had to be retrained on, even though everybody knew how to shoot the trailed towed 109, now we had to go be retrained on a 155.
After training from May to October, the battalion arrived in Vietnam on 30 October 1968, and by 13 November, the first round was fired by Battery A into the mountain range south of Phu Bai, Vietnam. All the components of the battalion received hostile actions at various times during the year of deployment. In May and June of 1969, both Battery A, Fire Base Bardstown, and Battery C, Fire Base Tomahawk, sustained attacks that left both wounded and killed in action casualties. The C Battery casualties took a heavy toll on the community of Bardstown. In the 1960s, Nelson County, Kentucky, Bardstown, had a total population of about 30,000. During the Vietnam War, the county had lost a total of 7 guardsmen and 4 other men serving in other units. The 2nd Battalion, 138th Artillery, came home from the war in Vietnam in October of 1969. In April 1968, the 2nd Battalion, 138th Field Artillery, with units in Louisville, Bardstown, Elizabethtown, and Carrolton, Kentucky, were part of a 24,500-man call-up of 88 units around the United States, including 570 Kentucky Guardsmen and 750 Kentucky Air National Guardsmen.
We went through that process of bringing the battalion together, seeing these young men make arrangements to leave their families and loved ones at home. But we had a great group of people, a great battalion that had been trained well. We packed our bags and loaded our equipment. We had men who were dedicated, who wanted to do a good job, and they did. There was a lot of emotions that had to be overcome. It was a time in history when there was turmoil within this country, a lot of emotions on what the war had done, what the Vietnam conflict was all about, but we never let this stand in the way of what we had been ordered to do.
Alpha Battery completed its processing at the Carrolton Armory. The other batteries as well completed processing at their respective armories in preparation for the call-up to active duty. After the call-up and processing, the movement of the battalion to Fort Hood, Texas began.
I drove my car to Fort Hood. Some of them flew. I think we had a convoy of personal cars, actually.
When it came time to leave Bardstown, we boarded buses and went to Stanford Field, and we boarded commercial airliners that took us into Texas. I don't recall exactly where it was. We then were boarded on other buses and went straight to Fort Hood. So there was no delay between Bardstown and Fort Hood. We were out of one element into the next while the sun was still high.
Fort Hood is located halfway between Austin, Texas and Waco, Texas. During the late 60s, Fort Hood trained and deployed many units and individuals for duty in Vietnam. The battalion was further attached to the 1st Armored Division. Accelerated training of the battalion was initiated in May of 1968 at Fort Hood, including concentrated field training and combat qualifications.
The 2nd Battalion, when we went to Fort Hood, we turned in the M14s, drew the M16s, we turned in the M114s and the, what was the old, M44s?
Yeah, M44.
M44 self-propelled howitzers. We turned those in and drew M109s. We drew all new trucks, multi-fuel vehicles.
Following the heritage of the Kentucky National Guard, these men performed their duties with the utmost of expertise. They were civilian soldiers called up to perform the task of liberating from communist tyranny a tiny country practically on the other side of the world. During their training, wives were allowed to visit. Some of the guardsmen had recently been married, with several living temporarily on the base and off the base with their wives.
A lot of us rented houses down there, and our wives came down. And she came down and stayed the whole time we were there, but there were so many of us, I guess, renting houses. We was about 30 miles out of Fort Hood. We were in a place called Lampasas, and we went together with Wayne Collins, and him and his wife stayed with us. We went together and rented a house together. Of course, that made it a little easier on the wives. You know, they were still, a lot of them down there that knew each other.
The wives stayed close to each other, even though the call-up changed their lives dramatically.
We went down for a week, and about the 4th of July of that year. My sister and her husband got married down there that week. But that, we just stayed a week and came on back.
We all went down like a bunch of us together in vehicles, and I could only get off for a week, and after I'd been down there almost a week, I called home to my boss at Conway Motor Company to see if I could stay another week, which I did. After the 2 weeks, I had to come back. Now, a lot of them stayed, but I had to come back because of work.
The battalion also had numerous brothers that would be serving together in a combat zone, justifying united we stand, divided we fall. After a 4-month period, the battalion transitioned to the M109 155 self-propelled howitzer. This included completing basic and advanced phases of training and completing the technical proficiency by the United States Continental Army Command.
I think the M109 gave everybody a feeling of confidence, and it brought a new level of sophistication to artillery. The M109 resembled a tank, which you've seen all the way through the first World War II and on. And so it brought the artillery up to a level that you thought maybe had been used in other combat units.
Finally, the battalion was ready for deployment to Vietnam. Although the battalion completed some preparations for loading of equipment prior, all equipment was packed and loaded on rail cars by September 1968. All personnel received leave time in September to spend time with their families prior to their deployment to Vietnam. Advanced elements of the battalion departed Fort Hood on 11 October 1968, with final elements arriving in country on 30 October. Total strength of the battalion upon arrival was 526 men, including officers, warrant officers, and enlisted men. The battalion was assigned to 24th Corps and within 13 days was fully operational. On 13 November, Brigadier General Alan Pixton pulled the lanyard on number 1 gun, Battery A, firing the first round into the mountain range south of Phu Bai, Vietnam.
I was there. I remember I was the chief of Gun 4 when that happened. Ray Spinberg prepared the gun to fire. Major James at the time was there, and Captain Berthold. The whole staff was there. It was a big deal.
Headquarters Battery, along with C Battery and Service Battery, staged at GLA Combat Base. Battery A and Battery B staged at Phu Bai. All the batteries were staged at these sites for initial in-country training. Fire support bases were next occupied by the 3 firing batteries. Following construction of howitzer positions, they began firing into enemy territory on 13 November 1968, providing fire support for the 101st Airborne Division and sometimes for the 1st Army of the Republic of Vietnam. The battalion's fire support bases included Anzio, Bastogne, Beach, Birmingham, Hank, Hill 88 to Nice, Quick 1 and 2, Sam, and Tomahawk. The battery sometimes rotated between the fire bases. GLA Combat Base, located southeast of Hue Airfield and due west of Phu Bai, served as the combat base of Headquarters Battery. It was the location of the battalion commander, Lieutenant Colonel Robert W. Cundiff. Lieutenant Colonel Cundiff, known as the Boss, was highly respected, well-liked by both the active and Guard components. Lieutenant Colonel Cundiff served in both World War II, Korea, and had been a member of the Kentucky Guard since 1948.
I started out in War II in 1944. I went to Europe, France, Germany, Austria, and then I came back and I stayed in the reserve until 48. That's when I joined the National Guard. And then we were mobilized in 1950. And went back in, and we went back to Germany during that time. And later I stayed in I guess it was 452nd in best I recall. And then finally I took over the 2nd of 138th, was mobilized, and that's when we went to Vietnam for a year.
Also serving in Headquarters Battery, GLA, was Captain Harold Loy, Battalion S1, a Korean War veteran and a member of the Kentucky National Guard since 1955.
Began my military career in 1952 when I was drafted into the Army and went to Korea. Stayed 14 months and came home. Got in the Guard in 1955. Started to work full-time for the Guard in 1965. The 2nd Battalion, the 138th Field Artillery. Greatest artillery battalion in the Army. Served with the battalion in a number of assignments. I was a full-time training officer, administrative assistant. Went to Vietnam with them. Served with some great officers and enlisted people. Still cherish those days.
GLA was a constant source of activity, serving as the heart of the battalion's presence in Vietnam. The meteorology unit, providing weather information, was also located here. Captain Julius L. Berthold, commander of Service Battery, was located at GLE as well. Captain Berthold started his military career for the Kentucky National Guard in 1953. He relates a story about M16s stolen from Guard convoy and retrieving them.
what happened, we had some M16s in a Connex container on the back of a truck, and the guys were going through a little village on the way to position. And when they going through, they had to be real careful because a lot of Vietnamese on bicycles and walking and what have you. And so the truck had to slow down and almost come to a stop, and did, I guess, occasion. And some of these black market Vietnamese jumped up on the back of the truck and cut the lock off the back of the thing, and they were clever at being able to do things like that. And the driver saw in the rear view mirror with them running out, and so he stopped and got back there right quick. Well, they had stolen, I think, some 16 weapons or something like that were gone. And he came in and told me about what had happened. And I told him to go back down there and tell that village chief that he had until tomorrow morning to get all those weapons gathered back up. And if he didn't, we were going to take that village off the map. And the next morning they went down with the truck, loaded up the 16 weapons that had been stolen, and brought them back up.
Yeah. Kentucky Adjutant General Larry C. Dawson visited the battalion in early January 1969. He reported the men were in high spirits, doing their assignments with enthusiasm, and that they had the respect of all the units they supported. Alpha Battery, commanded by Captain Gerald J. Wilhoit, located first at Camp Hockmuth, further assignments at fire support bases Bastogne and Birmingham, was credited with firing the first round into the Vietnam countryside. On 15 May 1969, Fire Base Bastogne, Alpha Battery was attacked with mortars, RPGs, and small arms fire. According to the operational report dated 31 July 1969, an RPG round hit the powder pit of Gun 4 Battery C, 1st Battalion, 83rd Artillery, which was co-located on the fire base with Battery A. A fire started, resulting in the detonation of 80 rounds and 175 millimeter projectiles.
I was actually sleeping in a GP tent with the mess section, and someone woke me up and said we're under attack, and I could hear small explosions, which later on I figured out were RPGs. So I went down to one of the guns, actually the one my brother was on. A word come down for everybody to hunker down, and I didn't get the call, but I was actually outside of the gun and to the rear. It wasn't much long after that big explosion, and that's when I got hit. I got a piece of shrapnel in my neck, and when it hit me, it picked me up in the air and just laid me out on my back, straight back. And then my brother was actually the first one there because he was right there beside the gun. The first sergeant came, and then they packed me up the hill to a point where the medevac choppers were coming in, or going to come in, and then they medevaced me out.
At first light, a sweep of the area produced 30 RPG rounds. During the attack, 2 men from Battery A were wounded in action. Bravo Battery, commanded by Captain James W. O'Keefe, located at fire support bases Anzio, Quick, Camp Hockmuth, and Tomahawk, Bravo Battery was the first to have confirmed enemy kills in Vietnam, as reported from infantry units in the firing areas.
In the battalion, Bravo Battery had the largest number of rounds fired. We fired more than the other batteries did. Not a lot, but we did fire more.
Charlie Battery, commanded first by Captain Lyle J. Thompson, later by First Lieutenant Samuel McClure. Captain Thompson was killed in a helicopter crash that was hit by enemy ground fire in March of 1969.
But we went up and Captain Thompson was our battery commander, and we were doing some firing with two guns particularly. And the weather was bad. You couldn't see, it was so cloudy and overcast, and he was viewing the rounds we were firing with this gun. He went up in a helicopter and was shot down and killed. We lost him there that day on that hill. They found him 3 days later.
C Battery was located at Fire Support Base Tomahawk.
You know, you had hills up here, big tall hills up here. You had them back behind you back here, and some up over here. And you were down in it, you know, and all of us, you know, from seeing all the old westerns and everything with the Indians and everything, you know, you always had the high ground. I thought, well, this doesn't make any sense to be down in this hole like this. And there was a road coming right out of the mountain and everything. I said, if we ever get hit, that's where they'll come from, right down that road. And that's where they come.
According to the after-action report, on 19 June 1969, the base was attacked by North Vietnamese sappers, mortar and RPG rounds. The enemy was able to slip through or under the perimeter wire without being detected, and due in part to heavy rain. The attack started in the vicinity of the mess hall. At approximately 01:45 hour, a member of the C Battery, going there for something to eat, discovered the enemy stealing food.
Like on my gun, well, David Collins, he's one of the guys that got killed. It was in my section, and he told me, he says, well, Skip said, I'm going down to mess halls, anything you want or anything? And I said, no. He says, well, we'll probably be down. If you have anything, just yell and we'll come up. Well, and he went down. It wasn't no time. He come back and he just said the gooks are in the mess hall. And then when he come around the powder, where I had the powder stored and everything, well, they threw a satchel charge in it and just blew it up. You know, all the powder and everything was on fire. And when they hit, they didn't hit just one little thing at a time. They hit everything at once.
An explosion occurred in the vicinity of the maintenance tent. The command post bunker and commo bunker were hit next with RPG rounds. RPG rounds were also being received in the vicinity of guns number 2, 4, and 6. Personnel got into the howitzers and buttoned up. The guns fired their counter-mortar plan and fired self-illumination, which would cover the area around the fire base 500 to 3,000 meters out.
You have to understand that the Fire Direction Center was the only bunker on the entire hill that did not have some form of damage, serious damage. I mean, we took direct hits, but we had enough sandbags to protect us from RPGs and mortars and so on.
Incoming rounds were immediately received at the executive officer's post. Perimeter bunkers opened fire with 50 caliber machine guns. RPG rounds subsequently knocked them out. Sappers were later observed throwing satchel charges at key positions in the fire base. Communications at the executive officer's post were knocked out by a satchel charge. The guns continued to fire the counter-mortar plan, with the sappers firing back with RPG.
There was a time there, I don't remember what had happened or what had went on, but they was hollering for number 2 gun to shoot some illumination. We needed some light. And so we started shooting illumination rounds. I don't remember how many we had, 15 or 20, whatever the number was, but we ended up shooting every one we had. We shot the first one and got a pretty good idea where they're popping off. You know, the illumination, we had to shoot them straight up in the air, and then they'd go off, and then you'd have lights, you know, with a parachute. And they would burn, I don't know, 5, 7, 8, 10 minutes, whatever. But when that thing was starting to flicker a little bit, those guys would let you know it's time to shoot another one. Every time we would raise that tube, they were firing those rockets at us. I mean, they just shoot, shoot, shoot. Those rockets was hitting over top of us. The only thing they could do then, if they shot over the truck, it would go over top of our gun. It would miss it completely. So the only thing they could do then is when we raised that tube up, they was trying to hit that tube. And they would shoot 4, 5, 6 rockets every time we would raise that tube. You could hear them going over, shoot, 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 shoot.
Guns 1, 3, 4, and 6 received direct hits from the RPGs, which knocked them out of action. Guns 2 and 6 received heavy RPG fire, but they continued to fire. Firing battery position at Firebase Tomahawk is located in a saddle between 2 hilltops. By knocking out the above perimeter bunkers, the enemy was able to command the high ground south of the firebase and bombard the battery position with RPGs. The sappers were able to knock out the command post bunker, commo bunker, and the executive officer's post bunker.
Because it knocked out the I think it had knocked out the commo, didn't it? Pretty quickly after it started, it knocked that out, so they didn't really have any communication much. Some of I guess the gooks that night, you know, all they had on was a pair of shorts pretty much, and then a lot of our guys that had jumped up out of bed, that's pretty much all they had on. So really nobody knew hardly who anybody was.
If it had been for the flares from the spooky, we would have, you know, we would have still been in the dark, literally, because we didn't know what was going on. We had, and like I said, we didn't move. I mean, there was, you know, you didn't know where to go, where was safe. So, you know, everywhere you were, that's where you were the safest, unless there was some reason you had to leave. And, but they did have, like somebody said, they had shorts and bandanas tied around their heads. It was, don't know why they had the bandanas, but they were hard to see. They were like they were almost, not in black paint, but something dark they had put on, because they were really, you know, best I can remember, they really were, you know, their skin's really dark, and they weren't that dark to start with.
Off-duty personnel and fire detection center personnel took up fighting positions in and around their bunkers and gun position.
I said, these guys need illumination. So they were cranking the gun by hand and everything. And then when I raised up, I could look out and I could see the exec post where they had the generators and everything, you know, for communication and everything. And I seen somebody out there, and I said, anybody got a rifle? And they said, yes. I said, give it to me. I done had that rifle, and I had it on a guy. I said, this guy raises up, and he don't have a steel pot on. I said, he's dead. That was Don Parrish. He raised up and had a steel pot on, so he was all right.
The way that our bunker's situated, our living space was on one end, and the work area was on the other end. And we were split up by just that short distance between bunker to bunker. And as the battle progressed, Don, I know, was over in the work area as well as me, and everybody was trying to man the doors, knowing that at that time that the Viet Cong was inside the wire. They had actually thrown satchel charges through some of the doorways from some location on the hill. We had some injured people as a result of the satchel charges, and then some of the bunkers that were being destroyed and falling in, those people made it to our bunker. Some actually dove through the door, and so we had people all over the floor and in bunks and cots, and from different degrees of injuries, some very, very severe injuries that were in our bunker.
Oh, Roger was our medic. He was, Roger was a member of the headquarters battery, as all the medics were, but he was assigned to our battery, and he stayed with us the whole time. Roger was, I believe, sleeping on the outside of his bunker that night after that rain had quit. And so he was very aware that things were happening very quickly, and he went to the aid of a number of people before he came into the fire direction bunker. He was probably outside working for an hour or more, treating people who had been hurt and helping them to get into the fire direction bunker. And then later he came into the bunker and treated people. Wayne Collins had suffered an enormous wound to one leg, and he was bleeding profusely, and I'm amazed that Wayne's life was spared, because Roger worked on him for quite some time trying to get to stem the flow of blood from his leg. They placed him on my bunk, and I know he had completely soaked a sleeping bag, and blood was actually dripping out of the bottom of the bunk onto the floor.
I remember Roger. He was a very easygoing, personal kind of guy, and I think everybody in the battery liked him. And that particular night of the attack on Tomahawk, the medic's bunker, as it was called, was destroyed. There were RPGs and satchel charges thrown in it as well. And Roger, he worked on several different people, and was injured himself. I think he had a leg injury, or I wasn't sure what injury he had, but I know he was medevaced out himself the next morning.
Now, I think actually he had caught a rifle round in his foot, and he was hobbling around, but was, Roger was he received the highest award of the entire battalion for our tour of duty. There was only one silver star handed out, and that went to Roger.
And we took a lot of rounds. I've been told some of the numbers that's been thrown out of how many North Vietnamese regulars were on that hill. There were quite a few. I don't know what the number was, but there were enough. They were using satchel charges, and 2 or 3 of them were satchel. 2 or 3 of them that I was against had satchel charges and was tossing satchel charges. And then there was 1 or 2 that had AK-47s, and then there's a couple of them that had rocket grenade launchers. And they were well trained, and certainly their intent was to take that hill, I think. They did knock out 4 guns, but they did not take that hill.
We still didn't even know the enemy was inside when we come out of the gun. We thought it was still mortars hitting the gun, hitting right around it. And one was standing on the front of our gun, I guess getting ready to put a satchel charge down the barrel. And then the other one evidently was standing right there at the door when I came out of it. No, we didn't have a clue that in our gun that there was anybody around anywhere until we actually got inside the bunkers.
ARA arrived at the fire base and started firing at enemy locations on the perimeter and the hills north of the fire base. At approximately 0230 hours, the enemy fired a green flare, which is believed to have been a signal for the sappers to withdraw.
The enemy was supposed to fire a flare, but supposedly they said he fired the wrong color, which meant leave the hill. So I don't know, I guess that's a blessing for us that that's what happened, if that's what he meant to do. But they said one of the enemy that they had captured said that he probably fired the wrong color flare.
Spooky arrived at the fire base at approximately 0230 hours, firing at the enemy's withdrawal routes, south, east, and west of fire base Tomahawk.
Then the Spooky, somewhere in that area, in that time frame, showed up. And they fired the miniguns, and if they were firing the miniguns at me, I believe I'd have gone somewhere else, because that was the most awesome sight I believe I've ever seen in my life. To witness one of those things firing at night is something to behold. It looked like a ribbon of molten steel just rolling out of the sky. You couldn't see the airplane. You couldn't see the airplane at all. All you could see was, you hear it. You could hear it flying around and see this molten red, look molten red streak coming out of the sky.
The sappers who infiltrated the fire base threw some 150 satchel charges into the bunkers, in addition to rocket-propelled grenades fired from above.
You could see destruction everywhere. You knew there was death everywhere. You knew there were wounded everywhere. I mean, in the process of, when we came out, the first thing I saw was parts of a human body that was really disturbing. And then medevacs started coming in, and we started getting people carried up the hill. Some walked up under their own power, and I know they took a screen door from the mess hall and used that as a stretcher, and it was pretty destructive atmosphere, certainly, because there was damage everywhere. There was very little that was not down. I know, for example, our big antenna never did go down, which I was kind of surprised at. Our generator banks were okay, and the flag was still flying.
That hill was pretty bad shape, but we secured it. Our flag was still standing there. They didn't take it. They did knock out 4 of our guns, but they didn't take that hill.
It was a mess, because you see the commo bunker was blown. They probably fired on it thinking it was FTC, and and, the fire direction bunker stood pretty well.
The attack destroyed an ammunition storage area, 4 of the 6 M109 self-propelled howitzers, 9 bunkers, the mess hall, dining tent, maintenance building, 4 ammunition carriers, 3 2.5-ton trucks, 2 3/4-ton trucks, and 3 Jeeps. It was determined in the after-action report that employment of counter mortar and artillery defensive fires prevented a complete overrun of the firebase. Firebase Tomahawk held itself intact throughout the attack. 9 sappers were killed by small arms fire and grenade fragments within the firebase perimeter during the attack. A sweep of the area outside of the firebase perimeter revealed 7 enemy soldiers killed and 1 captured.
The only time I went back to Charlie Battery after that was our battery commander of A Battery called me out of the line into the office the morning after the Tomahawk was hit and told me what went on. He said, you get a driver and go back to your unit. I know you got family there and you got friends there. He said, spend as much time as you need.
Kentucky National Guardsmen killed in action at Firebase Tomahawk: First Sergeant Luther M. Chappell, Spec 4 David B. Collin, Spec 4 Joseph R. McElvoy, Staff Sergeant James T. Moore, Spec 4 Ronald E. Simpson. 4 of the Guardsmen called Bardstown, Kentucky home. The other was from Carrolton, Kentucky. 18 other Guardsmen were wounded in action during the attack. The early morning hours of 19 June 1969 is a part of the history of the 2nd Battalion, Kentucky Army National Guard, and the city of Bardstown. For the men who fought and died there and their families, memories of the battle and its aftermath continue to haunt them.
2 guys from the Army came to the house, and of course, I had already heard that David Collins had been killed. When I saw the car, I thought, they were lost or something, but they stopped in front of the house. The 2 of them came in and told me he was missing in action. And that gave me a little bit of hope, because I thought, well, I don't know why, but, you hope that everything is okay. Then, I don't know, a couple of days later, they came back and said that he was killed.
I could see him standing there, and I knew then something was wrong. And that's when they had told me that David had gotten killed and that his brother Wayne had been wounded. And they didn't want me to call his parents or say anything to his parents about it until they got out there first to tell him. And so, I did what they asked me to do. But after that, I was in total shock. At the time, I didn't realize I was in shock. I just couldn't figure out why I could not cry. I mean, days later, it took me a while to realize why I never did cry, because I was in shock.
I hear this knock on the door, and I go to the door, and there are 2 military men, and of course they were dressed in uniform, and when he asked, are you, Elaine McElvoy, well then that's when I was prepared for the worst at that time, because I thought, this is not good at all. And my husband, Ronnie, was just termed as missing in action. That was on a Monday afternoon, June the 23rd, best I remember. We did not hear until the 25th. I think it was late in the afternoon, the 25th. And then it was another telegram saying he was no longer listed as missing in action, but had been killed.
Memorial services for Sea Battery personnel killed in action were performed at Firebase Tomahawk. 3 other 2nd Battalion Guardsmen were killed as a result of hostile actions between 1 June and 2 July 1969 while serving with other units. Sergeant Bertram A. Carr, Staff Sergeant Harold Brown, and Sergeant Jim Ray. Sergeant Carr was a former member of B Battery. Staff Sergeant Brown and Sergeant Ray were former members of C Battery, all part of the 2nd Battalion, 138th Field Artillery. During the summer and fall of 1969, conduct of operations was increasingly turned over to the Vietnamese. Also during this time, the firing batteries continued to deploy to different fire bases in support of the war in Vietnam. During their tour of duty, the battalion fired approximately 150,000 rounds. Following the completion of their tour in Vietnam, the battalion began arriving at Shoemaker Air National Guard Base in Louisville in the early morning hours of 11 October 1969.
When we came in, it was, I guess, late one night. No, as a matter of fact, I believe it was after midnight when the plane touched down in Louisville. And there was something like, a couple of thousand people sitting there. But it was a rousing occasion. You hear of the different insults that a lot of the Vietnam veterans had received, but we received none of that. We had nothing but celebration.
It was a very rousing time coming home, a very joyous time for all of those that were on the plane. And then when we did land in Louisville, all of our families already knew we were coming, so there were family members there to greet us when we come in. So we had a very, very warm welcome when we got off the plane. There was a lot of cheering, a lot of crying, a lot of hugging, and it was a very joyous time for us.
After their arrival in Kentucky, the Guardsmen were given leave. On 13 October, they reported to Fort Knox to be processed out of the active Army. When the units returned to their home stations, local celebrations were held to welcome them back home. One of the final events at the Kentucky Fair and Expo Center was when Lieutenant Colonel Cundiff returned the colors of the battalion to state control, thus symbolizing completion of the 2nd 138th Field Artillery's tour of duty in Vietnam. The memorial dedication was held on 12 November 1988, with Brigadier General Cundiff receiving a proclamation from Governor Wallace Wilkinson and Major General Michael Davidson, Adjutant General of Kentucky Army National Guard.
I gave that speech. I didn't have a note or nothing, but it was very moving to me. It really was. And then when you see that gnome or whatever they call it, and the way that shadows and whatnot, it shadows those names, I'll tell you, it was a very, very moving experience. And you think about these people. And
other memorials stand in Carroll County and Nelson County. Over the years, there have been many reunions of the battalion and batteries. In October 1995, several members of C Battery returned to Vietnam. One of the Louisville television stations sent a camera crew with them to document the journey and return to Fire Base Tomahawk. The battalion was awarded 136 medals, including 1 Silver Star, 23 Bronze Stars, 46 Purple Hearts, and several other combat-related medals. In later years, 3 belated Purple Hearts were awarded as well. Many members of the 2nd Battalion continued their careers with the Kentucky National Guard, with some attaining senior positions in the organization. 5 went on to become brigadier generals, along with another 5 becoming sergeant majors. 2 of the 5 sergeant majors became state command sergeant majors. Today, the 2nd Battalion, 138th Field Artillery still proudly serves the nation and the citizens of the Commonwealth of Kentucky. Its ranks are filled with soldiers who carry a proud tradition of service. Some are the sons and grandsons of the Kentucky Vietnam veteran Guardsmen. The war in Vietnam lasted 10 years, from 1965 until 1975. By 1973, most troops were gone from that distant land that many of the members of the 2nd Battalion, 138th Field Artillery, Kentucky National Guard had never heard of when they answered the call to duty in 1969. Saigon fell on 30 April 1975. In all, 58,132 Americans had lost their lives. 61,609 had been wounded, and 2,436 were reported to be missing in action. It was over. But for the men who fought and died there and their families, memories of the war will continue to haunt them for generations to come.